Hi, my friends. So glad you could be with me today in our Unfolding the Word time. We're in the midst of our study of Daniel. Yesterday, we began a new unit in that study, chapters 4 to 6. Today, I want to pick up our reading in Daniel chapter 4, looking and reading at some of the verses we began to look at yesterday. So join with me if you would. Daniel chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar, to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all of the earth, peace be multiplied to you. It has seemed good to me to show the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs and how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at peace in my house and prospering in my palace, and I saw a dream that made me afraid. And as I lay in bed, the fancies and the visions of my head alarmed me. As I told you yesterday, chapter 4, which is the final chapter in the book of Daniel, dealing with Nebuchadnezzar and his reign, chapter 4 introduces us to the process through which King Nebuchadnezzar finally came to his senses. Like the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15, one must come to their senses before they can come to the Lord. And the Holy Spirit's work in his life and in our lives to convict us of sin and bring us to our senses about such things is the preliminary first step to coming back and returning. Nebuchadnezzar was no exception to this coming to his senses issue. His coming to his senses was a long process. So was the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15. And probably could be said in truth, so it was in my life and in your life. Well, at any rate, Nebuchadnezzar relates to us in this chapter a process that took 7 years in which he was driven into insanity and gradually came to the point of accepting the truth about himself and about God and about what he needed to do about things. And he begins the chapter after those events to share those things with everybody. In fact, as I told you yesterday, part of the proof to me that Nebuchadnezzar was a changed man and that he found salvation is the fact that he was wanting to share such a humiliating period, a humble pie experience with everybody. No longer driven by pride in his life, but driven by thanksgiving to the God who is really there, and in humility, seeking to be a faithful witness to that God. At any rate, as I read you these verses, starting in verses actually 4 and 5, the king talks about his beginning experience, which at this point in time would have been at least 8 years before the time of writing this. I suspect even a little bit longer. But at any rate, he tells us that he was there essentially minding his own business, and he receives yet another prophetic dream. As we'll come to see, after trying to get it answered other ways, and unsuccessful in that, he finally and reluctantly gets Daniel in the scene, and Daniel interprets it for him, and he rejects Daniel's interpretation, or ignores it, perhaps a better way to say it. I suspect he thought it was probably accurate, but he didn't want to act on it. In a way, kind of reflecting the process that we saw in chapter 2 with the dream of the statue. Believing that it was probably the accurate interpretation, but not sure that he couldn't change its implications. At any rate, as we get into this chapter, we discover that this dream that God had sent him was a warning dream. It was a warning dream to Nebuchadnezzar that there was going to be a crisis brewing. If Nebuchadnezzar did not, apart from that crisis, bow the knee before God, acknowledge his sin of his own pride, and acknowledge God's rightful role in his life, that there would come a crisis upon this proud king. A crisis that would humble him. A crisis that would eventually lead him to his senses. Now the question is, when was all of this occurring in the timeline of Nebuchadnezzar's rule in Babylon? It's not clear, but this much we can conclude as we look at his reign and the timetable unfolding throughout the book of Daniel. We know for sure that the events transpired over an 8-year period. The dream came, it was interpreted. A year later, the dream is fulfilled. Then 7 years of insanity follows. So at least there is an 8-year period that is being described here. I think the chapter is about a longer period than that, but nonetheless, there's an 8-year period. It was a period of time, 7 years at least of that period, in which the king would have been unable to carry out his role as an emperor because he was driven to madness, living like an animal, as we'll come to see. Now, when would that have been? How could an empire hold together if the key figure in it is no longer able to be seen for that period of time? Well, let's look at it a little bit more. The period of time from 582 BC through 575 BC was a period of time where, according to historians and according to the annals of the day, that there were no major wars being fought. The expansion of the empire was finished. This period of time would have been quite a long time after the chapter 3 events, probably 20 years. At any rate, that period of time was a period of time where wars were not going on. Nebuchadnezzar's primary task wouldn't have been to be the figurehead of the armies that would just crush the enemies of Babylon. It was a period of time, according to the historians, where Nebuchadnezzar focused his efforts on building the glory of the capital city, the center of the empire. And as he did that, he developed Babylon into that impressive city that I have talked to you about at other times. The city that was so impressive that it stuck on in the memory of humanity, even to the point where, as we talked about, Alexander the Great wanted to go back and rebuild and work with that city to make it the capital of his empire. It was a period of time where, in the midst of the building of this prosperous and dramatic city, one of the great wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens, were built. This was a period of time, likely, during which this dream came to Nebuchadnezzar. Following this time, or in the midst of this time, archaeologists, historical archaeologists who study the annals of the day and the literature that was available and the records that were available, tell us that there was about a 4-year period in which no mention is made of Nebuchadnezzar. Very interesting thing that the head of the empire is suddenly quiet. I think that's the period of time that the 7-year issue overlaps that we've been looking at. Why would there be a key period of silence? What would have driven this? I think the reason for the silence in the records is the think tank of the day, the Magi order, which were the primary counselors to the king. They would have fulfilled many of the roles that most of the political appointees fulfill in our current era. This group looked at what was going on, was aware of God's judgment going on in Nebuchadnezzar, and they worked to prevent the empire from disintegrating, a self-preservation. If they'd have said, listen, the king is compromised, and they'd let that message be known, the enemies of the empire, those areas that were still fighting against Nebuchadnezzar or resistant and frustrated with having to subject to the Babylonian Empire, that would have encouraged them to implement wars because, hey, the key figure in Babylon's not there anymore. So, from a policy standpoint and from a protective standpoint, you wouldn't talk about the problems, health-wise or otherwise, of the ruler because you don't want to encourage the enemy. And even within Babylon, remember the Magi were the intelligentsia. They were the sharp ones. They knew if it became clear that Nebuchadnezzar was unable to carry out his role, there would have been others within the existing Chaldeans who would have been sort of jockeying for position to try to take over. That would have also led to bloodshed, disruption of the empire, and potential threat to the position of the Magi. So my guess, and it's only a guess, is that the Magi collaborated together and colluded to keep this period in Nebuchadnezzar's life quiet. At any rate, this period begins with the dream, and a year later the shoe drops. Let me read you verse 29 in the chapter 4. At the end of 12 months, as he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, and the king said, "Is this not great Babylon, which I built with my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty?" And while the words were still on his mouth, there fell a voice from heaven, and, as you would read further, the judgment of God fell upon him. The shoe finally dropped. Pride at its peak, the threatened discipline of God implemented. Join me tomorrow as we continue in our study and examine the two major lessons at the very beginning that the king is now sharing with all of humanity. God bless.